Hi, I'm Scott Mansell and welcome to Driver 61's University Series. Today's tutorial is an in-depth guide to everything you need to know to learn a circuit as quickly as possible. Firstly, I'm going to take you over everything you can do to prepare as well as possible before I take you over how to actually learn the circuit as quickly as you can when you get into your track car. So you may think learning a new circuit is just about learning where the next corner goes or which way the next corner goes. Obviously that's critically important, but there's a lot more to it than that and we need to go into more detail. Circuits wear out in different corners at different rates, and so as they wear out they'll be repaired, and these different surface types will actually give you different grip. So it's important to realize where the surface may change. The circuit will have bumps in various different areas. For example, in heavy braking zones, circuits that haven't been resurfaced for a while will be bumpy in these braking areas. You'll also need to know about the curbs, how much curb you think you can take, how much exit curb you can take, whether it's even possible just to run onto the grass a little bit. You'll also need to understand some braking references, especially in those big deceleration zones. So we need to understand if we can use a braking board as a reference, the end of a pit wall, for example, or a marshal's post. All these little references that will help you get up to speed on the brakes as quickly as possible. And we also need to have a think about camber changes through each corner. Obviously, the more camber that a corner will have, the quicker you can go through it, and any elevation changes that the circuit may have. And finally, we need to understand runoff areas where we may be able to make a mistake and it not be the end of the world. We may be able to run off the track onto a tarmac runoff section, as many of the new FIA standard circuits have. And in these areas, it means that we can actually push a little bit harder when we're learning a circuit than we might do in a corner that doesn't have any runoff. If you're racing, there's a few more things that you'll need to know as well. You'll need to know the location of the start-finish line, and it's important to understand that sometimes the start line can be in a slightly different position to the finish line. You'll also need to know where the green flag line location is. This is important if there's a safety car in your race, and you'll need to know when it's possible to overtake when the race is restarted again. Worth bearing in mind that some championships you can overtake as soon as the green flag is dropped, whereas other championships you have to wait until you actually pass this green flag line. It's also very important to know where the pit entry is. If you go to a new track, you may do your first session of 15 or 20 minutes and actually not realize where the pit entry is. So on your first lap out on the track, make sure you have a glance towards the end of the lap to see where the pit entry lane actually is. Also, if you're racing and you're doing pit stops, it's very important to know exactly where the pit lane speed limit lines are. Obviously, you can gain a lot of time if you really attack the entry and on the button on the pit exit as well. And finally, it's very important if you're racing to understand where the common overtaking or defending zones are. Certain circuits or all circuits will have certain corners that are prone to overtaking. So you'll need to understand this before you get there in case you're in a racy situation where you'll need to defend or you have the opportunity to overtake. So as we all know, racing can be very expensive. From track days to top level motorsport, it costs a lot of money. Therefore, when we go to a new track, we need to be as efficient as we can with our time to reduce that cost and get up to speed basically as quickly as we possibly can. So we're going to go through everything that you need to do or that you can do to research and plan before you even get to the race circuit, so you have as much information as you can possibly have before you even get on the track. So the first resource that you should visit is our very own circuit guides. We've produced a few circuit guides on here that are taken from an onboard footage of myself, and I voice over, commentate and draw over the video to explain in detail racing lines, braking references, where exactly you should be looking as you're going through a corner. They're very good, they're in a lot of detail, so if you have a few moments, go over to the circuit guide section of the website and take a look. There's only a few circuits on there at the moment, but please stand by and we'll be adding more in the coming months. The second port of call is to take a look at YouTube. YouTube's fantastic. Obviously there's millions and millions of driving videos on there, and you can usually find your specific car at the circuit that you're going to be visiting. Now, the first thing to say here is that you just need to be careful of the quality of the video that you're watching. And by quality, I mean the standard of driving. I've looked at many videos on YouTube, and a high percentage of them, the driving technique and the racing lines are not very good. So I don't want to suggest using YouTube when you may actually be using a video that isn't worth learning from. However, we've begun to make a curated list of videos by circuit and car on the Driver 61 site, and again you can take a look at those a bit later on. These are all high quality, good laps from good drivers on circuits, so it's worthwhile taking a look at those so you can begin to check out the racing lines and so on. So when you do find a good video of your car at the circuit that you're going to be going to, there's a few things that you should try and take away from that video and a certain rhythm that you should go through. So what I like to do is I'll watch the video a few times, a few laps of the video, just to get a feeling of the rhythm of the circuit and begin to understand where the circuit's going to go. Then after that, once I know the rhythm and the sequence of corners, I'll begin to look for a few references with the racing line and the apexes. For example, you can pick up where the apex point of this specific driver might be by seeing how far along a curb he's apexing, or if there's any small references. Then I'll begin to examine all the braking references that we could use. Now, I'm not saying that we should be using the exact same braking references as the guy in the video, because the day may be different, the car might be slightly different, different tyres and so forth. But you can see the general area that he's braking, and in that general area you can see if there's a marshal's post, you can see if there's a change of surface, you can see if there's an entry curb to use as a braking reference. And then it's important to try and store that information for when you then go to the circuit, and you'll know where these references are straight away. The final thing that you should try and take a look at, especially if the car, or only if the car is very close to the car that you're actually driving, is the approximate corner speeds. Now you can do this by seeing which gear the driver may be in for each corner, or some videos on YouTube actually have the V-Box or the aim system overlay, so you can actually see how quick and which gear the driver is in, and it just gives you a little bit more information to prepare yourself before you go to the circuit. You can actually make some notes of all these points as well, so the braking references is quite a good one, and all the apex references. And just going through the process of jotting down all this information actually helps you to learn it a little bit quicker. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm not saying that you should be copying the driver's lines and the braking references in particular exactly. Like I say, the circuit may be in different condition, the temperature could be different, the tyres and so on. So don't copy it exactly, but just use it as a general reference and to understand where the racing lines are going. Now the next thing to do is to try and spend some time in a racing simulator. The software now and the physical steering wheels and the feeling that you get through all of this equipment is just incredible. These circuits are often laser scanned, so they have all the bumps in, all the curbs are perfect, and it really is very realistic. If you actually use a professional simulator, which you can hire for about £150 an hour to Silverstone or one of the other various simulator centres, this time in the simulator can be really well spent. And I know it's a lot of money, but it's still cheaper than actually driving on the track. And obviously if you run off the circuit, you won't cause any damage to the car. Now, it's always good in these situations to have a coach with you anyway, even though it's just a simulator. They can guide you through the circuit. Obviously they'll have lots of experience at the circuit itself, so they can just help you pull out these braking references, just tweak your line even before you step foot in a car. So you've researched and prepared yourself as well as possible. Now it's almost time to get on the track. The first thing to say for when you go to a new circuit or any time on track if you're learning is to use a driver coach. Again, racing track days are expensive. If you want to get up to speed as quickly as possible, a driver coach is definitely the quickest way and the most efficient way to get there. The driver coach will have lots and lots of experience driving many different cars on all the circuits that you'll be going to, and they can give all that information to you simply and really accelerate your progression when you're driving on track. They will come and sit in the car next to you initially, giving you just a few pointers on the racing line. Now this can just bring you up to speed really quickly in terms of racing line, braking a little bit later into the corner, and in general driving technique. You can also passenger next to them. When I'm coaching, I like to, at least once a day, get the driver in with me while I'm driving so that they can actually experience what it feels like to put a good lap together. And if the driver's really close to me, you know, a second or two off my pace, it really helps them just to see that extra little bit that they need to give to find that extra bit of time. Now, the final thing that a driver coach can do really well, and that is very valuable, is give you a good data lap. Obviously, many race cars now and track day cars have V-boxes or AIM systems, data logging systems that use GPS to track speed, braking force, and so on. Now, yes, you can use data sources from different sessions or different days, for example, but there's nothing like getting a good data trace from that day in particular in your car. Then after the session and in between sessions, you can compare your data with the coach's data and see where the biggest areas of time loss are. Then you can focus on these areas. You can look at your braking trace, you can look at your throttle trace and see where the issues may be. Really focus on those areas and then make the quickest gains possible. Now, the next thing to do, if you have the time and the money, is to visit the circuit in a slower car, just on a track day. So this is for the races. If you're racing a radical or a quick GT car, it's much, much more efficient to go there first in a slower track day car, something like an MX-5, something where you can actually absorb more information. And it's something that I did quite recently, actually. And I have a driver who is racing in the Radical Championship this year, and he'd never been to Cadwell. Well, to go directly to Cadwell Park, which is known as a little Nürburgring, it's really quick track, like a country lane, very narrow, very bumpy, lots of elevation. It's a really difficult track. To go there in the Radical straight away would have been completely overwhelming for my driver. There's just too much going on, and you'd have to go too fast in the Radical to really get the car working. So what we did is he went there in a Mazda MX-5, which is a lot slower. You have a slightly better vision because you're sat up higher. And he went there for a day and just did as many laps as possible. And because the speed of the car is lower, you actually have more mental capacity to learn everything about the tracks, the bumps, the curbs, the racing line, and so on. Now, with this slower car, it means that the car is moving around at a slower speed, which obviously makes it a bit easier, and you need the car to be moving around so that you can find what the racing line is. If you're not having the car moving around, if it's not sliding just slightly, then it's more difficult to find the racing line because you're not being naturally pushed out onto the racing line. So one of the many things that I like to do when I get to a circuit on a race weekend is to walk the track. You get a really zoomed in, detailed view of the circuit. You can see the intricacies in the curves and the bumps and so on. It's a nice ritual to get into as well. Even if I've been to the circuit 100 times, I still walk the track before a race weekend. Now, if you're going to a new track, it's actually better to walk the track after you've done some laps. If you're walking the track beforehand, you might walk on actually the wrong line. It's very difficult to gauge a line when you're walking around the track. However, walking the track is actually more for spotting these detailed changes, such as the surface changes that we spoke about before, the curbs, so you can really actually see how the curbs are made up, whether they're going to be slippery if it rains, what the drop-off is like from the curb onto the grass, so if you run over that, and so on and so forth. You can also look to see how bumpy the braking zones are, if there's any bumps when there's a surface change. You can see what the exit AstroTurf might be like. So for example, at Silverstone and some of the FIA circuits, or all of the FIA standard circuits, there's AstroTurf generally beyond the exit curve. You can see what it's like to run on this. At many of the UK circuits beyond the exit curbing, there's grass crate into the grass. Well, if the grass crate in the grass, then often you can run onto the grass and it won't cost you any time. So just all these little pieces of information that you may not need to know, but when it does happen and you do need to know and you're running wide that one lap, well, you know that you can keep on going and run onto the grass plate and it won't cost you too much time. It's also good at these opportunities, although you should know already from the track guides and the videos where the larger runoff areas are. So when you go to a new circuit, it's important to know where these larger runoff areas are. The areas where, or the corners where you can maybe make a slight mistake, run wide, and if there's tarmac around the outside, you know you're not going to have a dangerous spin. And so in these corners, you'll be able to push a little bit harder. So finally, it's time to get in your car and go onto the new circuit for the first time. Now, the first thing to say is that, as I've mentioned before, don't push yourself too hard and don't go over your mental capacity. If you're instinctively driving and just thinking about getting the car around the track, you don't have any capacity available to actually think about the racing line and absorb as much information as possible. So my advice is to drive around at 60 or 70%, get the racing line beginning to get right and absorb as much information as you can. Now, when people or new drivers are learning a new track, their vision tends to come really narrow and really close to the car. Well, if you watched our tutorial on vision, you'll know it's really important to have a nice, wide and long vision so that you get all the information from the circuit long before you're arriving at the corner. Well, this is especially important when you're learning a new circuit. So really be conscious about thinking to keep your vision wide and as long as possible. That way you're getting the information, you can see through the corner, you can see where the apex is long before you get there, and then make the adjustment with the car to arrive in the corner on the correct racing line. One other tip is to make the apex of the corners a little bit later than you generally would or that you might have seen in your research. Now, the reason for this is that if you make the apex a little bit later in a corner that you're not exactly sure about what the racing line should be, it gives you a little bit more room for error. That later apex just opens up the exit a little bit more, and it means that if you do go in a little bit too quickly, then you have that extra room for error and you'll be able to collect the car together and go out the corner. Now, when you're learning the new circuit, you should get the racing line right and perfected and flowing before you try and push the limit of the car. So get the racing line right before you have the car moving around and you're reaching the edge of grip. Once you've got the racing line right, then you can start to push, you can start to begin to get the car moving around and at the edge of grip. Now, my advice is to do this in the slower corners or the corners that have a lot of runoff. Obviously, it's safer to do it in these areas. And if you make a mistake when there's a bit of runoff, then you're not going to damage your car. One other tip, because a lot of the time the mistakes will happen if you oversteer on corner entry. So when you're learning a new track, if you just go into the corner a little bit too quickly, a driver will tend to keep the brakes on a little bit too long and try and turn the car in, even though the rear might feel a little bit light. Well, what you should try and do is just to come off the brakes a little bit early so the front of the car comes up and it will actually give the rear of the car more grip, and then you're only going to get understeer. If you've seen some of our other tutorials on weight transfer and understeer, you'll understand this. And obviously, if you get understeer, it's a bit safer than if you get oversteer on corner entry. Now, when you're beginning to really push, if you're in a race car, it's likely that you'll have a data logging system. Most of these data logging systems give you a GPS delta time. Now, the delta time will tell you whether you're up or down on your best lap at that point, on that specific point on the circuit. So it's really useful, and I use it all the time when I'm driving, even if I'm not learning a new circuit. It can just help you define which racing line is the quickest through a corner. So for example, if I'm coming up to a hairpin left, I'll glance to see what the delta says before I hit the brakes. If it says I'm up on the previous lap by 0.2 of a second, I'll remember that. I'll come into the corner, I'll change my line, maybe I'll open up the exit a little bit. Now, this means that I might lose a little bit of time on the entry, but because I'll get the car turned and straight earlier, I'll open up the exit, I'll be able to get on the throttle, and it's likely that I'll actually make some time up on the exit. So use the delta to get little pieces of information and actually see what's the quickest way through the corner. Once you've done a few sessions and you feel that you've got up to a reasonable pace, now it's the time to compare your lap time with your driver coach. So ask him to go out, set a decent time, come in and go over the data for 15 or 20 minutes. And you'll be able to see the variances in the speed trace, in the braking pressure, throttle application, and so on. Obviously, if you have a good coach, he'll translate all of this information for you and give you just a few specific points, 2 or 3 different things to work on in your next session. And hopefully you'll be able to bring your car and yourself up to speed more quickly. Now, the final thing to do, maybe after half a day or at the end of the day, is to make some notes. Some notes on the circuit, some notes on your driving and handling. We're actually going to go over this in a later tutorial. But just going through this process of knowing exactly where you're braking, so you can say, coming into Druids, I am braking about 10 meters before the bridge, for example. Just going through the process of downloading all this information from your brain actually helps it to sink in. And also you'll have a complete notebook or circuit map full of notes for the next time to remember when you come back to the circuit on your next visit. So hopefully the first time you go to a new circuit won't be on a race weekend. So you'll have hopefully done some testing beforehand. After you've been to the track, then it's a good time to try and research the overtaking and defending areas on a circuit. As I mentioned earlier, there'll be certain corners where overtaking is easier than on other corners, for example. So the best thing to do is to watch previous races from the circuit that you're going to be racing at. If you just take a look at any British touring car race, for example, you'll be able to see where all the big overtaking spots are. And you'll actually see when the cars are in a train behind each other very closely, how the racing line changes, because all of the cars will be defending. Because if they leave the door open, somebody will slot inside. So just watch some previous races and you'll just gather a lot of information about where all these overtaking spots or defending spots may be. So that's it for this detailed tutorial. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please share it with your social media and I'll see you next time.